"Are you deaf, old man?" I said, "This area is restricted. Now move along before I have you escorted out of the building entirely." The voice was sharp, laced with the kind of impatient arrogance that only comes from youth and a freshly pressed uniform. Lieutenant Gavin Kent stood with his hands on his hips, his polished boots gleaming under the sterile fluorescent lights of the corridor. He was addressing the janitor, an old man hunched over a floor buffer that hummed a low, monotonous tune. The man, who couldn't have been younger than 80, wore faded gray coveralls and had hands that looked like they were carved from old wood, gnarled and stained from a lifetime of work. He didn't seem to have heard. The buffer continued its slow circular dance on the linoleum. Kent's jaw tightened. He took a step closer, his voice rising in volume, cutting through the machine's hum. "Hey, I'm talking to you. This is the entrance to the Global Communication Center. You can't just be loitering here. What's your name?" The old man finally shut off the machine. The sudden silence in the hallway felt heavy, drawing the attention of a few passing analysts who slowed their pace. Curious, he turned his head slowly, and for the first time, Kent saw his eyes. They were pale blue, remarkably clear, and held a stillness that was unnerving. They didn't look confused or doddering. They looked ancient, like twin pools of water that had seen the rise and fall of mountains. "Name's Samuel," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Just finishing my section. Be out of your way in a moment." "Your section ends at the red line, old-timer," Kent snapped, pointing to a painted demarcation on the floor 10 feet back. "This is a level 4 secure zone. How did you even get this far? Did you lose your way?" The condescension dripped from every word. He saw a frail, elderly janitor who was probably going senile, a potential security risk born of incompetence. He saw a problem to be managed, a box to be ticked on his daily report. Samuel's gaze drifted from Kent to the thick, soundproof glass wall of the conference room beside them. Inside, a dozen high-ranking officials, including the facility's commander, were gathered around a large table, their faces tight with concentration. A massive screen on the wall showed a video feed of several foreign dignitaries. It was clearly a meeting of immense importance. "They moved the line," Samuel said, his voice calm and even. He turned his steady gaze back to the lieutenant. "Happened this morning. Memo came down from facilities management. My supervisor initialed the work order." Kent scoffed. "A memo? I'm the floor security officer for this wing. I would know if the restricted perimeter was changed. Now I'm not going to ask you again. Take your machine and go." To punctuate his command, Kent reached out and grabbed Samuel's arm. It was a mistake. The moment his fingers closed around the thin bicep, he felt something that didn't belong. Under the loose fabric of the coveralls, the old man's arm was not the frail, withered limb he expected. It was ropey and hard as iron cable. The surprise made him hesitate for a fraction of a second. In that second, Samuel didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He simply stood there, his placid expression unchanging, letting the young officer hold his arm. The message was clear, delivered without a single word. "You are not a threat to me." The quiet dignity of it was more infuriating to Kent than any outright defiance would have been. He felt his face flush with anger and embarrassment as the passing analysts now openly stared. His authority was being challenged not by a soldier, but by a janitor. "That's it," Kent seethed, tightening his grip. "You're coming with me. We'll see what your supervisor has to say about this." But Samuel's attention was no longer on him. His gaze was fixed on the silent drama unfolding inside the glass room. The American commander was leaning forward, his brow furrowed. The translators in the corner were speaking frantically into their headsets, gesturing with their hands. On the screen, one of the foreign officials, a man with a severe face and a tribal headdress, was speaking, his words obviously causing agitation. A young analyst, Specialist Eva Rosales, hurried past carrying a tablet. She was a gifted linguist recently assigned to the GCC. She too glanced into the room, her expression clouding with concern. The official was speaking a notoriously difficult dialect of Farsi, one spoken only in a remote mountainous region bordering Afghanistan. Even their best interpreters were struggling. They were getting the gist, but the nuance, the critical life or death nuance, was being lost. She could hear the garbled, uncertain translation coming from a speaker just outside the door. Then she heard another voice, low and right beside her. He's not threatening to close the pass. He's warning them. He's saying the pass is already compromised by a third party. He calls them the Shadow Walkers. Eva froze. She turned to see the old janitor Samuel standing perfectly still, his eyes locked on the man on the screen. He hadn't been speaking to her or to the lieutenant who still had a hand on his arm. He had been speaking to himself, a soft guttural murmur. The Farsi was perfect. Not just the words, but the accent, the rhythm, the cadence. It was the Farsi of a native speaker. Before she could process this, the conversation in the room shifted. A different official, this one from a West African nation, began to speak rapidly in a dialect of Hausa, his tone sharp and accusatory. The translator scrambled to switch gears again. The quiet voice beside her said, "They misunderstand. He is not accusing them of theft. He is asking for the return of a guiding star, their name for a stolen navigation device. He fears it will be used to bring fire from the sky upon his people." Ava's mind reeled. This was Hausa, and not the standard dialect taught at the Defense Language Institute. This was a rural variant thick with idioms she had only ever read about in textbooks. She looked from the janitor to the lieutenant, who seemed oblivious, too wrapped up in his own petty power struggle. The main screen switched again. A stern-faced Russian general was now speaking, his words clipped and then, to the absolute jaw-dropping astonishment of the three recruits, Master Chief Franklin, a man who bowed to no one, drew himself up to his full height, raised his hand in a crisp, perfect salute, and held it. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rumbling with a respect so profound it seemed to shake the very air. "I apologize for the inexcusable behavior of these trainees. It will be dealt with." Evelyn gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "They're just boys." Franklin, full of more vinegar than sense. Franklin held his salute. "That is not an excuse, ma'am." He finally lowered his hand and turned his gaze on the three statues in training uniforms. The full force of his legendary wrath descended upon them. "Peterson," he roared. The recruit flinched as if struck. "What in the hell do you think you were doing?" "Master Chief, she was in a restricted area. I was." "You were what?" Franklin cut him off, stepping so close their noses were almost touching. "You were disrespecting your elders. You were assaulting a civilian. Or were you just being a dumb, arrogant child who thinks a little bit of muscle makes him a man?" The recruits stood ramrod straight, their eyes fixed on the horizon, sweat beading on their foreheads. They had never been the focus of such intense fury. "You three think you're tough," Franklin continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous serrated whisper. "You think because you can run for miles and swim in a cold ocean, that you're worthy of wearing the trident. You're not. You're not even close. You know why?" He paused, letting the question hang in the terrified silence. "Because you have no respect. You have no humility. You look at this woman and you see someone old and weak. You see a target for your pathetic power trip." He gestured back at Evelyn. "You clueless fools have any idea who you're talking to, do you?" He didn't wait for an answer. "This is Evelyn Cross. Does that name mean anything to you?" "No, of course it doesn't. They don't teach you history anymore. They just teach you how to fight. But they forgot to teach you who wrote the damn book." He took a deep breath, his voice rising again. This woman was one of the first. She was operating behind enemy lines when your grandfathers were still in diapers. She was a pioneer in underwater demolition, a master of unconventional warfare. She served for 30 years in the shadows in places you've only read about in classified reports that you'll never have the clearance to see. The recruits' faces were pale with shock, their minds struggling to reconcile the image of the frail old woman with the legend Franklin was describing. That hand-to-hand combat technique you all keep failing in training, the cross-dominance takedown. Guess who it's named after? That's right, her. She invented it. She taught the instructors who taught my instructors. Every single thing you think makes you a badass. She was doing it better, and she was doing it in secret with none of the glory you kids so desperately crave. He turned back to Evelyn, his expression softening again. Ma'am, I am truly sorry. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. It's all right, Franklin. They didn't know. She looked at the three young men who now refused to meet her gaze. Their arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind raw, shame-faced youth. Look at me, she said, her voice gentle but firm. All three slowly, reluctantly raised their eyes to hers. The uniform you want to wear, she began, it isn't about strength. Not just physical strength. It's about control. It's about discipline. Mostly, it's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. It's not a weapon to be used against them. She took a step toward Peterson, who flinched again. She stopped in front of him, her clear gray eyes searching his. You were scared, she said softly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. When I didn't react the way you expected, you got scared and you defaulted to force. That's a weakness. In our line of work, that weakness gets people killed. Peterson could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. Humiliation burned in his cheeks. Evelyn reached out, not with aggression, but with the slow, deliberate motion of a teacher. She gently took his right hand. May I? She asked. He nodded again numbly. She turned his hand over, her gnarled fingers surprisingly strong as she positioned his palm. You have strength, she said, tracing the lines of his muscles. But it's unfocused. You lead with your shoulder. You put all your power into the grab. All your intention is right here. She tapped his bicep. But the real power is here. Her other hand tapped her own temple. And here, she tapped her chest over her heart. With a movement so swift and fluid, it was almost a blur, she shifted her weight, used his own forward momentum against him, and applied a whisper of pressure to his wrist and elbow. Peterson found himself spun around, his arm locked behind his back in a hold that was completely inescapable, yet caused no pain. He was utterly neutralized. The whole thing took less than a second and required almost no visible effort. She released him just as quickly. He stumbled forward, catching his balance, his mind reeling. He had been completely and effortlessly dominated by an 80-year-old woman. The physical proof was more devastating than any verbal reprimand. That is control, Evelyn said quietly. Not hurting, not breaking, just ending the threat. The goal is to finish the fight before it even begins. Your biggest weapon isn't your body. It's your opponent's perception of it. She looked from Peterson to the other two recruits who stood in stunned silence. You want to serve? Then learn to see. See past the surface. See the person, not the package. That's the first and most important lesson. She then turned to the Master Chief. That's enough, Franklin. They've learned their lesson. Don't ruin them. They have potential. Franklin looked at the three humbled recruits, then back at Evelyn. He nodded slowly. As you say, ma'am. He turned his glare back on the trainees. You three are on latrine duty for the next month. Every morning before PT, and you will report to Chief Davis for a history lesson on naval special warfare pioneers. You will write me a 10,000-word essay on the contributions of Evelyn Cross. Am I understood? Yes, Master Chief, they chorused, their voices cracking with a new, deeply felt respect. Now get out of my sight, he barked. They practically tripped over each other in their haste to disappear. Alone on the path, Franklin looked at Evelyn. "You're too forgiving, Eve," he said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Someone had to be," she replied, her gaze drifting back to the memorial garden. "I have to go now. The roses are waiting." She turned and began walking up the path, her small trowel in hand. She didn't look back. Franklin stood and watched her go, a small, unassuming woman in a canvas jacket, walking with a quiet dignity that radiated more power and authority than an entire platoon of heavily armed soldiers. He watched until she disappeared into the garden, a living ghost, a hidden hero tending to the memory of her fallen brothers. What we witnessed that day was more than just a dressing down of some arrogant recruits. It was a living lesson in the true nature of strength. It's so easy to judge the book by its cover, to dismiss the quiet and the old, to assume that power always shouts and boasts. But the most profound strength, the kind that endures, is quiet. It's humble. It's found in the steady hands of an old woman tending her roses, a woman who carries a history of valor that the world will never see. It reminds us that heroes don't always wear capes or uniforms. Sometimes they wear worn-out jackets and carry garden tools. And it's our job to have the wisdom and respect to see them for who they truly are. Thank